All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to give a big thanks to Felice and the CAM for partnering with us to make this event possible, and Max, who's running around out here helping set up. And before I introduce Kelsey, I wanted to give a reminder to some of the events that's coming up. So we have cocktails with creatives every second Tuesday of the month at Johnny Goldbrick's right now, and which is coming up on June 14th. Judson Design, which is located near Passon Provisions, is having a studio tour and a small talk on the 16th. And James Victori at Sundance on June 23rd. For those of you that don't know who James Victori is, he's a designer that runs an independent Brooklyn design studio. And he's been featured at the MoMA and in the history book of graphic design. Some of his clients are MailChimp, Adobe, Time Magazine, and Esquire. And he also does a weekly video series called Burning Questions to help with finding that spark or any inspiration. So check it out, it's on YouTube. Another event we have in June is Web Fluency for Non-Coders with Dan Simonowski at the Iron Yard, and he's going to be talking about how the communication between designers and developers can be a little bit more efficient. And that's going to be on the 30th, which will also be another free event for AIGA members. So for Kelsey, Kelsey Ruger taught UX and design thinking at Bauer College of Business, is a former president of HIMA, and was a recipient of HPJ's 40 Under 40 in 2012. He's currently the Chief Experience Officer at Nomadic, and we definitely appreciate him for doing this for us. And please welcome Kelsey Ruger.
Thanks everyone for coming out through the humidity. Man, summer has finally hit. I was telling someone today, the only thing that kind of made it better is today's the last day of school for most districts, so we'll have less traffic when we go to events like this in the evenings. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, kind of give you a background about why I'm here tonight. When I was probably about 12 years old, I lived next door to this little boy named Steve. And every summer, his grandfather would come visit, and he would spend the whole summer. Now, as a kid, you got to remember, this is an old guy, and we didn't want to listen to him, but he would always spend the summer telling us stories about people he grew up with, people he served with in the military, and a lot of those stories centered on leadership. And at a very early age, I sort of got enamored with this concept of leadership, not because he was telling these great stories, but because I always as a kid thought, man, it's really cool, these guys get to control stuff and they get to go and run stuff. So much to the point that when I actually got to be manager for the first time, I actually started putting together this diagram that I thought would help me understand how to lead people. And there's a lot of concepts that I still follow in this. But what I figured out is that it really doesn't have to be this complex, and that leading people and getting results is actually pretty simple. And with that, one of the things I'll tell you is that what I'm going to talk to you guys tonight is not just about practical advice on leading creatives, because people always want to say, well, how do you lead creatives? They're all crazy. They never stay on target, and they want to brainstorm all the time. And I say, well, to me, leading creatives is no different than leading anyone else. It just takes a special type of an approach. And so with that, I will ask you guys, why are some people able to get results from groups of people very effectively and pretty consistently, where every other person fails at it, or they have a hard time getting people to follow their lead? Have you guys ever worked with a manager who thought they're doing a great job, and behind the scenes you were thinking, oh my God, this is a disaster, what is going on? I think we've all kind of worked with that type of person. And so my story with learning the sort of secrets that I followed throughout my career, and things that I tend to teach everyone that I mentor, starts with this book. And this was a book that was given to me when I was about 17 years old. And the backstory is I had a godfather who was in Amway. And every time he tried to recruit me to go do Amway stuff, he'd load me down with all these books. You guys ever experience this, like people in Amway, they give you like a ton of books to read? But this was one of the ones that I picked up and I read it. And the thing that I learned about leadership from this book is that being an authoritarian is not the same as being an authority. And a lot of times what people get taught as they come up through their career or they go through their education is that leading is about being authoritarian. And what actually you find, if you're doing it effectively, it's the complete opposite of that. And so to kind of start you guys with what we're going to talk about tonight, this is one of my favorite quotes, and it says, "There are leaders and there are those who lead. Traditional leaders hold a position of power or authority. Those who lead inspire us." And those who lead or those who inspire us, there's really three things that I have recognized about people who are really good at building these environments where people can thrive and they get good results and people aren't killing each other and arguing all the time. And the first thing that I would tell you is that creative leaders understand that groups of people are more like organisms than mechanisms. And what I mean by that is, how many of you guys have gone through any course or any training or sat in a meeting and people say, we need to operate like a well-oiled machine? Have you guys ever heard this phrase referring to people? What I will tell you is, people just don't operate that way. People have emotions, they have attitude, they have behavior that when you're talking about a machine, you don't have to deal with. And so one of the first things that I learned very early on is, as a leader, you have to be empathetic and understand that you're dealing with growing, evolving beings, that you have to actually understand them individually and manage them differently. And it has really been enforced for me as a teacher. Because when you walk into a classroom and you have, 30 or 40 kids or 30 or 40 college students, every single one of them comes with some pre-existing knowledge, some pre-existing behavior patterns that you have to treat differently. And as a leader, one of the things that we have to understand is that today in the business world or today in our careers, you have to really focus on people and understanding how they operate. The second thing that I learned is that establishing the environment you want is more about creating that environment where growth can happen versus establishing authority. And the analogy I always use is a few years ago when I was running an agency. You guys remember the phase where everybody had these potted plants on their desk, and there was this real wave of people wanting to water the plants every day. And one of the things you realize about plants, if you've ever worked in a gardener, you've ever worked on a farm, is you can't make things grow. What you can do is you can cultivate the environment so that the environment is one in which things can grow. And there's a great story that Ken Robinson, who is the guy on the last slide, tells about Death Valley. And if you guys know anything about Death Valley, nothing grows there, ever. But a few years ago, they had a lot of rain, and in a couple of months, the floor of Death Valley was covered with flowers. And what that tells you is, when you have a seed that is in an environment where it can't grow, what happens is it shuts down, it gets this hole, and then it can't grow. And the same thing happens to people. Think about when you have been in a situation where the environment was not one where it was conducive to growth or conducive to you doing a really good job. Most people in those situations shut down and they don't produce what they're capable of producing. And so really understanding that the climate that you work in is super, super important as well. And the last thing that I will tell you is they have a organic or climate-oriented view of creativity and leadership. The other thing that I like to talk about a lot is creativity. And typically those conversations, if I'm sitting down with someone, let's say I'm sitting with an engineer or an accountant or someone who is not in a career path that requires them to produce visuals or things that people consider to be design. They almost always will do something, they'll do something like look at my handwriting, or they'll look at something in my sketchbook and they'll say, I can't do that because I'm not creative. And my response is almost always, the sketches and the handwriting have nothing to do with creativity. That's a function of practice. So practicing the techniques for drawing or writing. The reason my handwriting is so neat is because my mom used to make us practice every single day, like letter after letter after letter, and I have stuck with that pretty much my entire life. But people see that and they associate that with creativity because they are not capable of doing it. People see leaders and they associate that with authority because they've never been in that position. I've also had people who work in creative positions tell me, oh, I could never be a leader because that's just not me, I'm not an authority. And what you'll find is that people who do this well don't view it that way. And what I wanted to give you guys tonight were some things that you can use in work or in your career to become more of a creative leader, and not just necessarily someone who is creative but a leader, but it's someone who understands how to combine those two concepts to get things done. So let's talk about why the world sees leadership the way it does today. A lot of the management techniques that we follow and a lot of the things that we believe come right out of the Industrial Revolution. And I promise you guys it's the most academic I'm going to get tonight. But when people were working in factories, they needed a really good way to manage procedural work. It was the same work day after day. Usually you didn't switch. It was usually on an assembly line, so everything was metrics driven, right? There was no, I need to create a brochure, or we're building a website for a company that didn't exist last year. So they knew the work that was going to happen from day to day didn't require a whole lot of creative thought. What's happened is companies haven't recognized how much of our economy has shifted to a point where people are working in jobs where from day to day they may be solving problems that never existed before. And having sort of a linear approach to every single type of problem doesn't work because some problems can't be solved that way. And so what needs to happen is we need to change our view of leadership and creativity. And for me, it's been really simple. When I really started to study leadership, what you find out is that leadership is not about authority, it's about influence. And creativity is not necessarily about art and design, it's about problem solving. And so when you think about those two concepts in that way, it makes it really easy to understand what types of things you should be doing, either as a manager or as a person who works in an environment where these types of things happen on a daily basis. And so this is probably most critical now because the types of problems that you're going to face going into the future are probably going to get more complex. They are probably going to involve things that probably haven't been invented yet or we haven't really thought about combining yet. And so you really have to have let me not say you have to have a different approach, you have to have multiple tools in your belt. There's still going to be things that you have to do the traditional way, like when it comes to things like time cards and reporting, there's still procedures for those. But when it comes to being creative and solving problems, sort of the go from point A to point Z, this has actually never worked for me. I've never, even regular problems, something happens, I have to turn in a time card and my computer shuts down, right? So I think most people think of going from point A to point Z as the best way to approach a problem. It is if you know what that problem is and you've solved it before. But most of the time, problem solving ends up looking like this, right? You kind of have a good idea of where the beginning is, You maybe know what end you want to get to, but it's going to be a lot of scribble around on this. And for those of you who work in the interactive space, you probably know a lot about this. Building websites, building mobile apps, iteration is really how you get from point A to point Z. And so the way I break this down for people I mentor or my employees is there's two types of problems to sort of think about. There are mysteries, and I call those tame problems. We know the data. We have a good idea of what the solution is. We just have to get there. Now, it might be a hard problem, but we know what to do. A lot of what we are dealing with today are what I call puzzles, where there are pieces missing from what you need to do. And we call these wicked problems. And a lot of people will tell you that wicked problems are things like hunger, poverty. Those are things that everybody has an idea about how you could solve them, but we haven't solved them yet because there's variables that you can never account for. And you have to be able to solve both types of problems. And so as a leader, one of the things you have to be able to do is influence the type of behavior you need internally so that people know how to address both types of problems. And so for me, there's two things. I call one internalizing, and what are the things that you need to do inside the company or internally as a manager. And the other is externalizing, and I'll talk about internalizing first. And this is sort of the behavior that enables you to address wicked problems appropriately. So the first thing I will tell you is I'm a big storytelling buff, and I like stories like Star Wars, you know, the hero's journey. And I'm going to use this example from Star Wars because I think everybody gets it. Most of the time, managers view themselves as this guy, right? And at the same time, the employees view the managers as this guy. But really, what both should be doing is viewing a manager or the leader as that last guy. And the reason I talk about Yoda is because Yoda, even though he was the master, he was more of a mentor than what we traditionally think of as a group leader. He would guide them, but a lot of times he let them figure out the problems on their own. A lot of times he would let them fail on purpose. And you think about this, and the thing about the mentor or the person in this role is the mentor is never meant to be the hero of the story. And in a lot of cases, managers don't get that. And this is actually the one time I will call out things that I think a lot of creatives who move into managerial positions struggle with. If you've been the best designer on staff and now you're the manager, your job is no longer to be the best designer. Your job is to teach the other people to be better than you. And that's essentially what the role of the mentor is. The mentor teaches you how to be better than them, and then they move themselves out of the way so that you can go and do the work. So thinking about how to help people be a mentor was really sort of the driving goal behind putting these slides together. And there's basically 3 principles that I'll walk you guys through that managers can use inside the company to help move in this direction. The first principle is really rethinking what we think of as traditional management techniques. On the excuse me, on the left side here, I think about, these are all things I came up with: conformity, compliance, and command and control. And I was always sort of the person who would argue with the boss that you can't ever force compliance, but you can get people to comply if you give them the right environment. And so I had a boss once, and I'm going to tell you guys a couple of stories like this. That some of you may have heard this one story, but I worked with one guy who was an entrepreneur, and he was the majority owner in the company. And one day, let me back up. We used to have these company meetings every Monday, 60 people stuffed in the room, like this big open area that we had. And he liked us to be there for these company meetings at 7:30. And one day there was something happening on a street that was leading up to the building, and one of the guys came in late. we all knew this because he'd already told us he was going to be late. But when he walked in, the owner of the company stopped the meeting and he said, "Why are you late?" And the guy said, "Well, there was an accident." He's like, "Well, you should have set your alarm earlier." And I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, because how would he have known that there's going to be an accident? But what really stood out to me was the fact that the next thing he said was, "Well, you're not going to be late." And Craig, the guy who he was talking to, shook his head yes. And he says, "No, you don't shake your head. You say yes, sir, to me." And at that moment, I knew he had lost the entire room, because it wasn't just the guy he was embarrassing that heard it. It was every other person in the room who now, under this sort of command and compliance thing, can make a decision, right? Like, he can't be there to watch everyone. And they could always decide, you know what, I'm going to stop working a little bit early today because nobody really cares about whether I do a good job or not. He only cares about whether I say yes, sir. It also works in environments where your boss insists on you being there until 5 o'clock, or your boss insists on you being there at 8 o'clock on the dot, when you in your head know, hey, I'm working past 5 every day, or I'm putting in extra hours. And as a manager, understanding this sort of shift between these two is really critical, because in most environments we work more than 40 hours a week anyway. And a manager that micromanages when you show up is missing out on the bigger picture of the contribution that people make. The other thing that you have to be really careful of when you're thinking about this command and control is some people work faster than other people. And by enforcing the rules sort of across the board the same way, you actually could be penalizing your most productive employees, because you're making them follow the same pattern as the people who maybe move slower. And so understanding two things about mechanisms that have worked really well for me is, I say processes are for work, leadership is for people. If you want to enforce processes, what you do is you train people on how to work the processes, but that's where you get your productivity from, is understanding that the purpose of process isn't to control people, it's to actually help people who are very talented do their work better. But what happens is people get that thing reversed. The other thing is that we tend to drive performance through context, not control. And every time I say this, people say, well, what the heck does that mean? Basically, it means the amount of damage something can do is how much control we put over it. So for example, if I bring in a new intern, and people, actually there's nobody here that has been an intern for me, but when we bring in new interns, we give them a lot of control. We don't lock them down and have them doing really junk work. We give them real work because we understand they're going to learn it anyway. We don't give them control of like our books, right? Like, because that could be dangerous. But if the intern needs to make changes to the website, we just make them an admin. Like, it doesn't make sense not to give people access to the tools that they need to do their work. And so we don't use process to replace people or managers, right? Like, we let managers manage the people. The processes are intended to help the talented people do more work. And we have a saying, me and my good buddies, we have a saying that if you have good processes, the good processes should make your most talented people 10 times more productive, because it's not about controlling their work, it's about removing the obstacles so that they can do a better job. So principle number 2 is really rethink about how you view the concept of learning. Now, in the traditional model, I always think that that model is way too narrow, because it's based on previous performance. And this is one thing that's really stuck out to me, mostly because the majority of the work that I do now is mobile. But think back when the iPhone first rolled out, and there was no apps in the App Store. No one had ever solved these problems before, so there was no best cases. You had to go out and figure this stuff out on your own. The problem that most companies face is they try to base everything on that, and it doesn't always work for each problem. So they're focusing on identifying and correcting problems in the external environment. And the reason I focus on this is because when you're dealing with a really talented person and something goes wrong, whose fault is it? To that person. It's not their fault, right? It's always some external factor. And so we always say that talent can only take you so far. You have to really rethink how you, especially when you're dealing with really, really talented people, or people who have succeeded at everything that they've done in life. This is really, really critical because when they make mistakes, a lot of times it's hard for them to recognize that they probably did make a mistake. And so what we tend to do is we focus on capacity and understanding how much people can take on at one point and how they learn from each particular instance of work they've been given. And there's a model that we use to do this. And this is what most people have learned, and this is what I call the fixed mindset. And I'm going to talk a little about the difference between a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset here in just a second. But typically what happens is you have a highly skilled professional. They do the same work a lot, and they're really, really good at it. And this is what we call single loop learning. A lot of times we spend our whole life acquiring credentials, mastering one discipline or another. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Like when I work with user experience professionals who are highly educated, they've been through a lot of school, they know all the heuristics. Man, it is hard to get them to understand that potentially that might not be the best solution because they know it's the best solution in their head. That's a problem because the real world just doesn't work that way. And so what we actually try to enforce is what we call double loop learning, which is the growth mindset, which means maybe this way doesn't work. You take a step back and you try a different approach, and you learn from failure. The best way I can recommend to do this is working on projects where you have to iterate a lot and you have to make changes. If you are a visual designer, the best example I can give you is doing what I call parallel design. So don't just produce one, produce two. Because how many of you have ever worked with someone who produced a single design and they will defend every bit of that design to the end instead of letting go and saying, okay, maybe I can change that. One of the ways we avoid that is by doing parallel prototyping or parallel design so that you have more than one idea. And if one's bad, you don't mind throwing that one away because it's not the only thing you came up with. All right, so if we want people to move toward this growth mindset, maybe you should incentivize them to move that direction. And so a lot of times what people will say is we need to work on motivation. And what I will tell you about motivation is most people get it wrong. One, it's nearly impossible to motivate people. They have to be intrinsically motivated to do a lot of things, especially this type of work. And I actually would argue that when you're dealing with highly creative work, incentivizing people with money actually makes performance go down because now they're focused on the money and not the end goal, which they were already incentivized to do because they intrinsically wanted to do it. And so there is a common belief that when people have the right attitude and they're committed, they can be motivated. The problem is if you're dealing with someone who potentially has never done this work before or has never failed at that work before, even if they are committed and in line with the work, you need to make sure that they think about their learning and how they approach their work effectively. And so those are the three things that I tell people to focus on when they're kind of thinking about the foundation of how to put all this stuff together. But the biggest thing I will tell you is that when it comes to creative work, it's not about who you are, it's about what you do. And people ask me, hey, Kelsey, how do I become more creative? And I say, you do creative stuff. So you have to get out and you have to do If you want to become a better artist, you have to draw. If you want to have better handwriting, it's really not that hard. But I tell my daughter, she wanted to learn how to play the ukulele, and about 2 years ago, I bought her a really nice one. It cost me like $250, and she never picked it up the first year. But then she came back and says, well, if I want to learn, what do I do? Can you pay for lessons? I said, no, you need to go in there and you need to practice. And she learned it. I kid you not. It took her 2 weeks to learn the majority of what she does today. And now she can write her own chords. She can do her own songs. But it's because she practiced. And I always tell people, when it comes to creativity or leadership or any of this stuff, you actually have to do it. You can't just read it in a book or go to a seminar. Especially if you go to training, you're going to get so much information in training. It's going to be like information overload. You have to pick the bits out of there that you can do and do them over and over and over again until they become second nature. And so one of the principles that we talk about with both leadership and creativity is figuring out the behaviors that you have to have. So if you're going to build a team that thrives on creativity, don't focus on making the people creative. You can't do that. Instead, you have to focus on getting them to act creatively. So it's giving them the right tools, it's giving them the work that they like doing, as long as it's in line with things that you have to do as a company. And then you have to make this shift from what I call common sense leadership, which doesn't always work because it's not always common to people. And there's 5 principles that I tend to like. And I'm going to use someone here as an example. She's going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe you called me out. But one of my favorite things to do is make sure people have temporary inconvenience for permanent improvement. And so I'm going to use you, Joey. So when Joey first got out of college, she came to work with me, and I put her on probably the biggest project we had, largely because I knew she was capable, and because I know when you give people things that are just slightly above what they probably think they're going to do, it increases their ability to do things a lot. This works in teaching, this works in sports, this works in management. The way you improve is not by doing things that you're already good at. The way you improve is you have to work at what we call the edge of your ability. So if you're practicing an instrument, playing the same song that you've been able to play for the last 5 weeks and wondering why you're not getting better isn't the way to get better. You have to practice stuff that you haven't done before. And so one of the things that I would recommend is giving people work that is not too far outside of their ability, but it is outside of their ability, because dealing with those challenge zones is where people will get better. And you just push those zones out slowly, and you look back at the work you've been able to do in 6 months or a year, and you'd be surprised at how much improvement people can make in any area. The next thing that I will tell you guys is adopting a growth mindset. Now, typically I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what the difference between fixed and growth is. I have a video that I'm going to play for you guys next that explains it really well, but what I will tell you is a lot of people, by the time they get to be a couple of years into their career, they struggle with this fixed mindset because they've been good at something, and they have now gotten into a situation where maybe they have to change that thing. And the example I give now is, I guess it was about 2 years ago, maybe it was about 3 years ago. How many of you guys have heard of the program Sketch? So it's a interactive program for, most of the time we use it for drawing web interfaces or mobile interfaces. But I had a couple of designers start with me, and they were Illustrator pros. Like, they could do anything in Illustrator. They could do anything in Photoshop, and I told them, nope, we're going to do everything in Sketch. But one of the things that I knew in the hiring process is that these two people were flexible, and that they were willing to learn new things and say, okay, it's not Illustrator that I'm good at, it's actually illustrating that I'm good at. And so if I'm good at illustrating, I can use pretty much any tool, and I don't have to make an argument about why we should still use Illustrator when this other tool fits better into our work process. So that's the type of thing that I tend to look for when I'm hiring, is I'll ask questions in the hiring process that let me know if I tell this person we're going to throw away everything we're using, that they're not going to have a fit. And that they're capable of learning those new things quickly, because that happens a lot now, where you are presented with a new situation and now you have to learn something new. But I'll let you guys listen to this video.
What is a growth mindset? We can liken the theory of growth and fixed mindset to the story of the tortoise and the hare. To have a fixed mindset means to believe one's basic abilities, intelligence, and talents are just fixed traits. A growth mindset means that you understand that talents and abilities can be developed through effort, practicing, and persistence. People with a fixed mindset often develop and peak before their peers, appearing to be more intelligent and successful than everyone else. However, this is a dangerous trap to fall into. The moment we believe that success is determined by an ingrained level of ability, we will be brittle in the face of adversity. This is what happens to the hare. The tortoise, however, with a growth mindset, continues to power through and work hard, overtaking the hare eventually and winning the race. Nice one, Terry.
Thanks, narrator.
You're welcome, Terry. How many of us think ourselves as not maths people, or creative, or sociable, or athletic? If we are to fulfill our potentials, we have to start thinking differently. We are not chained or bound to our current abilities. Take this tree, for example. It needs to be fed with lots of minerals and food for it to grow, just like you do. By continuing to nurture and care for this tree, it can grow taller and stronger than other trees. The trunk and branches will literally explode with growth, just like your brain. Your brain is malleable and physically can change size and grow. Even more so at a young age, the activity and growth of the brain during your short teenage years is phenomenal. So how do you do this? Well, there's no shortcut or secret solution. It's as simple as hard work, commitment, and perseverance. In any chosen field or career path, you are certain to have some level of failure at one point. But at each pitfall we come across, you must learn to overcome it. There is a popular movie quote that goes like this: "Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up." Batman wasn't born with any superpowers, abilities, or talents, and just as Gotham's Dark Knight understood, he had to train relentlessly to succeed. So must you. Right now, these fixed mindset learners might be ahead of others, but they are afraid of failure. And when they reach the peak that they're comfortable with, they'll just stay there. They will never reach their full potential. Failure is the most essential step to success, and as the growth mindset continues to improve, they will overtake the rest. If you feel like you're in a fixed mindset, don't lose hope, because there is a lot we can do to change that. But start by listening to our fixed mindset voice, and when you hear it, talk back with a growth mindset voice. If you hear "I can't do it," add "yet." Fixed mindsets can change. So what mindset are you in?
So this, a lot of times when I talk to people about this concept, I have to give them concrete examples. So imagine if and actually this is one of the studies they did. You're a 6-year-old kid and you're given math problems. And when you finish the math problems correctly, the teacher says, "You're so smart." What happens to this kid who thinks they're smart and super intelligent when they get a harder problem that maybe they're going to struggle with? And this happens to a lot of kids because they get into these, and I hate this so much about the way our educational system is set up, is we teach kids to get A's, we teach kids to shoot for perfect scores, when really the goal is to learn. And so when in this study, what they did is they had one group of kids that they told they were smart, and you did a really smart thing on that problem. The other group of kids, they told them, you did a really good job solving that problem. And the way you solved that problem was really good. the second group of kids, when they were given harder problems, got them right too. The first group of kids struggled and wanted to do something else. And I think that's one of the things that I always point out to people about the growth mindset is when you teach people to be growth mindset oriented, when they fail, they don't give up. If you're fixed mindset and you think I'm either good at something or I'm not, people tend to give up really quickly on things that they are actually capable of doing. So the next principle that I talk about this probably more than any other piece of this puzzle is hiring people who have a T-shape. And so that means they have a depth of knowledge in a single area, but they may have interest across a different spectrum. And I always show people this example because this is usually easy for them to understand. Imagine if you're a visual designer or an interaction designer. You're going to have a depth of skill in those areas, but you may be interested in cognitive psychology. You may be interested in architecture, and all of those different domains can be combined. Not that you have to be experts in every area, but having interest in other areas outside your core expertise actually makes you more well-rounded and a better fit in a lot of different teams, because it won't mean that you can only do that one thing. It means that you have some experience doing some other stuff. And the last one is based on a lot of research that I've done on creativity. And what are the things that I see people who are creative have as a capacity. And so I've broken these into two different areas. One is what I call creative literacy, and that's the ability to identify or understand. And the second is what I call creative capacity. And so there's 4 in each zone, and I'll kind of walk you guys through each one. Fluency is what I call the ability to generate a lot of ideas. Good ideas, bad ideas, you're just capable of generating ideas for a problem. Articulation is once you have an idea, you are capable of articulating what it is and how it fits into the problem that you're solving. Flexibility is generating ideas across a number of different disciplines. This is one of the things I call, when I'm speaking, I was taught that this means you speak from overflow. Like if you have a lot of interest in a lot of different areas, when you're a speaker or you're a teacher, you can combine different things and analogies that you can use to teach. And I think that comes from this flexibility area. Originality, pretty straightforward what that one means. On this side, these are really about how you apply things that you already know or can get access to. One of the things that really kind of bothers me sometimes is when you deal with high school students now, a lot of times they have access to more information, more computing power than we ever had growing up, but they don't use it. So I've had kids come up to me and say, hey, what does this word mean? And they're holding their phone in their hand, right? Like they're holding their phone, and I'm like, they have to learn how to be resourceful. So one of the things that I always recommend is spending a lot of time with people and teaching them about the different resources they have access to solve problems. I'm not one of those people that will tell you go Google it. I'll actually help you walk through how to find it, but because that's kind of obnoxious when people tell you just go Google it. The other area that I would tell you has been very useful to me is the idea of repurposing. And so what it doesn't say in my bio is my degree is actually in computer science. I designed all through school. I had a minor in international business, but I worked as a designer all the way through school. The problem was when I was in high school, I went to Reagan, which at the time was a computer science magnet school, and we learned all of the desktop publishing. So we knew how to use the programs. The problem was that in that day and age, you couldn't get the types of jobs that you can get today as a designer. And so I was encouraged to go the computer science route when I got out of school. But I guess it was about 6 months after we graduated was when the web really started to take off, and there was lots of companies popping up, and it was an opportunity to move. But what happened was all of that computer science training that I had from school and programming when I was a kid, I could repurpose it because it was easier for me to understand the programs we were building or the software we were building because I knew what was happening underneath. So I was able to repurpose that. I will tell you guys, I repurposed my learning from being a waiter every single day because you learn how to be patient. You learn, how many of you guys know the term in the weeds? Like everybody, we're all in the weeds now, and so you learn how to consolidate tasks and you learn how to do more than one thing at a time. So when you repurpose, you're able to recall things from a different career or a different project and use them in the project. Now, I will tell you the thing that I see people struggle with is resilience, and that's being able to stick to a problem until you figure it out. A lot of times I see people give up on problems before, just before they hit the answer, when if they had just stuck with it a little bit longer, they could have gotten to that answer. So those are, I covered a lot of stuff tonight, but I guess one of the things that I will tell you is not in there ever did you hear me talk about giving people rules to follow or this is exactly how you manage a certain type of person because it doesn't work. And I learned that I had the opportunity to be a manager pretty early in my career, and the one mistake I made was because my boss made me do it early on, and I learned from that lesson. I worked at Prodigy, and we had a team of developers, and one of them was really, really fast. He was done with his work for the day. And the CTO walked through, and he happened to see that guy playing a video game. And so he calls me into his office, and he's like, you need to go tell them no video game playing. But what's the problem with pulling a whole group of people into a room and telling them don't play video games? In this case, the other 14 people weren't doing anything. And so they were getting lectured about something that they didn't do. But they called me on it. And they're like, hey, it wasn't us. And he was done with his work. So I learned a valuable lesson is just go talk to the person. Or there's a lot of times I just will ignore people asking me to do certain things that don't make sense in the business environment. So I'm not telling you to ignore your boss, but use your common sense when you're dealing with people because my philosophy has always been you have to get things done that your boss assigns you, but the people who work for you are actually the people who get stuff done for you. And so they're unwilling to work for you or uncooperative, you're going to have a hard time getting stuff done because you can't do it all by yourself. So that's what I have for tonight, and thanks for having me.